Thank you, everybody, for joining in today's session for the Climax Seminar Series. We are honored and delighted to have two speakers from EPFL today, and the focus is on corals. Just want to point out again, all the directions. Please keep your video and microphone off unless if you're speaking. Be courteous, be cordial, and of course, if you want to ask questions, you can raise your hand or type them in the chat. So with that, I'll just go directly to our first speaker, who is Professor Anders Meibom, who's professor at the Laboratory for Biological Geochemistry at EPFL, and also a professor at personam at the Institute of Earth Science at the University of Lausanne. Professor Meibom is a physicist by training. He works with the geochemical approach to geological and biological processes, notably on the metabolism of symbiotic marine animals such as corals. And he's also the director of the Transnational Red Sea Center. So he will give a presentation today on that topic. And Anders, whenever you're ready, and just stop sharing. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to give this presentation. Now I have to share, by the way, just a second here.
Yes, yes, please.
And where is that happening? It's happening here. There's screens everywhere. Share like that. Presentation mode like that. Now we should be okay.
We're good.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to present for friends and colleagues. This is nice. So let's talk about corals. Now, coral reefs. How do I change this in my little presentation here? Here we go. This is how they have to look like. This is how they should look like. Some of them, fortunately, still look like this. You see healthy corals. You see fish. This is how it should be. The corals are really, the coral reefs are really the hotspots of biodiversity, in the ocean. They are host to millions of species. And so just as a natural resource, they are extremely important for the functioning of how our oceans function. But they are also very, very important to hundreds of millions of people in terms of the ecosystem services that these people can extract from healthy reefs. There are hundreds of millions of people living on the shores of the countries, mostly in the tropics and the subtropical belt around the planet, which are directly depending on the ecosystem services from healthy coral reefs. You can think of the way coral reefs protect the coasts from waves, from erosion, from flooding during storms. But that's actually sort of it's important, but it's some kind of an indirect, if you want, effect of the reefs. A very direct, really day-to-day service from the reef is seafood. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people living off what they can fish from a healthy reef. And of course, many of these countries' economies are getting a very important injection of money from tourism that are directly linked with these reefs because of their beauty and their attraction. Now, there was something going on in the chat here, but that's not for me. Okay. Now, the real problem today is that many of our coral reefs, they look like this. Okay. The corals are dead. You see here that this is from the North Great Barrier Reef in Australia. The corals are dead. What you see is this desert of destruction. The skeletons, the carbonate skeletons that the coral form are left behind, overgrown by algae and biofilms, etc. And because the corals are at the bottom of the ecosystem, these reef ecosystems, when the corals die, the whole ecosystem collapses. So you see no fish here. Basically, fish stocks are plummeting, and of course, the ecosystem services that people are depending on, they disappear. There's no fish, and certainly the attraction for tourists is also gone. Now, let me give you some of the hard, brutal numbers. In the last 30 years alone, we have lost more than 50% of what we call the pre-industrial coral reef cover globally. And at the rate at which we are losing coral reefs today, we're expecting only 10, or make it 15, but something like 10, 15% of the corals and the reefs and the ecosystems they support are expected to survive even past the middle of this century. That's in 30 years from now. It's tomorrow. Now, why are they dying, these corals? Well, they're dying because of a mixture of local and global effects. Local environmental stress, poor water quality from pollution, bad fishing practices, and simple physical destruction. Too many people running all over the reefs and destroying them. But those are local environmental stress factors, if you want, which in principle we can manage. if we do it right, if it's done right. And some countries are doing it fairly well locally. This is in principle manageable. Unfortunately, there is on a global scale a factor which is extremely efficient in killing corals, and that's global warming, which of course leads to rising water temperatures, more and more frequent heat waves that brings the temperature up over a certain threshold, stress threshold from the corals, at above which they simply get so stressed that, to make a long story short, their metabolism and their physiology basically collapses. And on a timescale of a few weeks, if these conditions are maintained, they will die. This is a phenomenon called bleaching. I'm not going to go into, I don't have time today to go into all the biology of this, but this is really the big killer on a global scale of corals. And this is happening repeatedly with increasing water temperatures. The Great Barrier Reef, which is sort of our iconic big reef, it's the biggest reef structure in terms of surface area that we have. It has a surface area the size of Italy. It's huge. In the last decade, even the last 5-7 years alone, we've lost tens of percent, 10, 30, 40% of this reef because of this coral bleaching phenomenon, this stress factor from primarily driven by global warming. So there's really no way to sweeten this up. Huh? We are basically we are witnessing an absolutely catastrophic destruction of nature and biodiversity. With no matter how you look at it, it's really a bad situation on a global scale for coral reefs, and therefore for our oceans and for the many people that are depending on these reefs. So in this really bleak context, there is something very interesting that happened that really ignited a real hope, which is that we discovered, and we, I say in a large sense, our lab was involved in it, but with colleagues, in particular groups of Israelis, colleagues in Israel, I'll get back to it in a short moment, but it was discovered that up in the Red Sea, particularly in the northern part of the Red Sea, and in this Gulf here, the Gulf of Aqaba, we don't know so much about the Gulf of Suez, but it's probably the same, but certainly in the Gulf of Aqaba here, and generally in the northern part of the Red Sea, we have today a population of corals that is extremely resistant to the effects of global warming and can take much, much more heat, future heat, without stressing, without bleaching, without dying. And this, of course, creates a real hope for us. I mean, I say us, and I say it in a broad sense for humanity, if you want, to preserve at least one major coral reef ecosystem functioning and alive beyond the end of this century. And almost no matter what, global warming trajectory we will be sitting on. And by now, it's almost impossible to avoid more than about 2 degrees or less than about 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which is predicted to extremely stress or kill most other coral reef ecosystems around the world. But these corals, they actually have the capacity, if you want, to absorb this heat and not only not be stressed, but actually function quite well. Okay. And this creates a real hope for us to preserve a major reef ecosystem. Now, how was this discovered? Well, we were working primarily in Latin Israel here with this is a marine so-called Inter-University Institute for Marine Science in Latin Israel, where our colleague, Professor Meibom Oliver, who was the real pioneer in this, he was the guy who first understood that these corals were special. He has built a very interesting, underneath first of all, you see here, these are the corals. You see them just in the water around here. And up here is this marine station with many very interesting labs, good labs to do all kinds of analysis and investigations of these corals. And underneath this tarpaulin here, Meibom has built a fantastic system. It looks like this. It's so-called Red Sea simulator. And it consists, I think there's 120 different aquaria or experimental tanks in which you can control all the key environmental parameters, the temperature, the acidity, the salinity. You can add different levels of pollution to see how different organisms from the reef are stressed. And therefore he can simulate future climate change. And for example, he can just slowly begin to ramp up the temperature and see how the corals are behaving. And that's exactly how we discovered doing this, that these corals are extraordinary in their capacity to resist warming. Long story short, most corals around the world, they live, I would say, 1.5, maximum 2 degrees below the threshold, temperature threshold, that above which they can no longer, they get stressed and they die. But these corals in the Gulf of Aqaba can take up to 5-6 degrees more heat than they currently experience during the summer maximum and still function. So it's an exceptional, thermal resistance that they have. Okay, and so why do they have this? Well, we think it's because of the way these corals have migrated into the Red Sea. Basically, the evolution history. Today we have corals in the Red Sea that populated the Red Sea after the last ice age. I'll skip some of the details here, but basically the corals we have in the Red Sea system today, they migrated from the south here, from the strait, from the Indian Ocean. I can go back a little bit. I'll show you the Red Sea again here. So the Red Sea, the only natural entrance to the Red Sea is down here in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, down here. And so all the corals we have living in the Red Sea system today, they came through here. And if you look at the key to this is the thermal gradient in the Red Sea. It's extremely warm waters in the south and much colder temperatures up north, because we're looking at a very long Red Sea system that basically is oriented, north and south. So all the corals that we have in the Red Sea now or in the upper northern part of the Red Sea, they've come from down south here. Their ancestors came through this very, very warm water. They had to adapt to very warm conditions, and then they could migrate further up as a population. On the coral, individual corals don't move, but as a population, they could migrate further up into the Red Sea, and ending up to populate the northern part of the Red Sea, where the temperature is 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees lower than down south. And because of this migration, this evolution in the Red Sea system, we have today, by chance, it's like a gift of nature, which we haven't done much to deserve, I must say, but we have it. We have a population of corals in the north that still remember how to live at very warm temperatures, which their ancestors adapted to, but they live, in fact, under temperature conditions that are 4, 5, 6 degrees lower than that. And that is why these corals can absorb so much more global warming than any other coral population in the world. And so that is really what has created, this real hope of preserving a major coral reef ecosystem alive for future generations. But of course, this is a game of global warming versus local pollution, because you can always kill corals. Even just because they're resistant to global warming and warmer temperatures doesn't mean they won't die if the system is polluted. And here, it's clear that the protection of these unique corals, they really are unique, it is a regional challenge, because the Red Sea system, which has to involve all the countries around the Red Sea, because the Red Sea system is very small. It's not a very big body of water. The gulfs here are like bathtubs, okay? Any type of pollution or environmental perturbation will spread rapidly through the system, and of course will not stop at any national boundaries. So this traditional approach, if you want to coral reef protection, each nationalistic, each nation for itself, we do what we can on our coast, and the neighbors do whatever they want. It simply doesn't work, because even if a country is doing extremely well in terms of protecting their corals, managing their fisheries, managing the activities, tourist activities, managing the pollution levels, etc. If the neighbor or the country across doesn't, the corals go together. And so it became very clear that if we have to preserve these corals, it has to be done on a regional scale. Now, if you look at this map here, it's a satellite photo, so it's not really a real map, but in case you're not very familiar with the region, I can walk you through the countries. We have Yemen down here, which of course is a humanitarian disaster because of the war with Saudi Arabia. The coast of Saudi Arabia goes all the way up here. It goes into the Gulf of Aqaba. Jordan just touches here. Israel touches here. And then it's the Sinai coast of Egypt. And then it's the Egyptian coast down to about here. Then it becomes Sudan. And it becomes Eritrea. And Djibouti is just peeking in at the bottom. So of course, there are 8 countries around here. And of course, it's a geopolitically complicated region. There's no doubt about that. So it became pretty clear once we realized the resistance of these corals and the opportunity we have to actually preserve a major coral reef for future generations. It became clear that it became clear that it's a regional challenge. And given the complexity of this region, well, it's a question of not only organizing on a regional scale science, it's also to inform the protection policies and create the best possible basis for protecting them. It's also very much a question of creating dialogue at the high level, high governmental levels, to make sure that the protection is taken care of and implemented, if you want, on a regional scale. So it has to be a mixture between science and diplomacy. And this is actually where some of the motivations for the establishment of this Transnational Red Sea Center, which we established here at EPFL with the direct support of the Swiss Foreign Ministry in 2019. And the idea really is to do this, approach we call science for diplomacy and diplomacy for science, and use the neutrality of Switzerland, which we de facto are, and its long tradition for fairly high level science. That's one thing, but also for effective international diplomacy, to marry these two into this approach to try to become a neutral partner for the region, to establish on one hand scientific collaboration between the different countries in the region around the Red Sea to provide the best possible scientific basis, and on the other hand, through the diplomacy, and all the ambassadors in the region now are working on this with us, to create very high level governmental dialogue in cases where often there is not much in today, and these things are beginning to work actually. So that is at least is the sort of the fundamental idea of the Transnational Red Sea Center. So if we look a little bit under the hood, some of the pillars, the main pillars of this Transnational Red Sea Center, just to walk you quickly through what we would like to do, is on one hand to ensure and help organize, and I mean help organize the local, between the local scientists in the region. This is a very important point. It's not us, it's us helping to collaborate and create collaborations between the local scientists in the region, but to create these regional scientific collaborations, to provide the best possible scientific basis for the protection, which has, on the other hand, to be implemented by the governments of the region in collaboration. To do this through the science diplomacy, to really have the diplomats talk at a high level. And I have to say, the Swiss Foreign Ministry has played an extremely active and positive role here. The ambassadors are at work in every single country, and they're really opening doors at very high level. And there are actually dialogues that are beginning to take place, which haven't taken place for many years or not at all. And so there's something happening here around this strong, of course, common interest of these Red Sea nations to preserve the corals, because they all have a clear interest in this. Now, another big factor or component of this work we want to do is that everything has to be done and will be done according to the principles of open science. And that's not just because open science is the best science. It's very much also a question of trying to create trust between the different partners in the region. Because if everybody knows that they have access to the same information, it's much easier to have a dialogue about how to move forward together. And then an aspect of education of the next generation scientists to ensure the future. And here it's really a question of the time scale of the vision for all of this. We are not talking about a time scale of 3, 4, 5 years here. We're talking about a time scale of decades. And this is because there's two reasons for that. First of all, that's the time scale on which climate change will begin is acting upon the system. This is not happening from year to year, it's happening on decades. And so we have to follow the system on that time scale. And also because there are major socioeconomic developments in the region, actually, that are playing out on this time scale, and that will have a clear impact on the marine environment and on the coral reefs. So on that time scale, it's extremely important that we educate the future generations of scientists and park managers, etc., that will carry forward this monitoring and this protection in the future. And then another aspect is that we would also like to use other means other than diplomacy, other cultural and artistic expression to create dialogue, between the different players and different partners in this, and all of this with this overarching, fundamental goal to try to create regional scale protection of these unique coral reef ecosystems. So just very quickly at the end here, where are we today? Well, this summer we are going to start the science work for real and systematically in Jordan, Israel, and most likely also in Sudan and or Djibouti. We are also in the process of putting in a network as fast as we can of these online autonomous coral health monitoring stations, as we call them. I think I have a picture of it at the end, maybe. And so, the science work is happening, and at the same time, the diplomatic dialogue is also really happening because of the extremely efficient work and the participation, the efficient work of the Swiss diplomacy, and really the active participation of the Red Sea countries in this. And so, in terms of science, we have a systematic. We basically define some science packages that we want to do, and I'm not going to go into any kind of detail. But I just want to point out that the science packages we are going to implement and that we're going to pursue, they're all cutting edge, if you want. In fact, this seascape genomics here is exactly what Oliver Selmoni will talk to you about in a few minutes. But they are not just science for the sake of science. They are science packages designed to provide the information we need to optimize the protection of these corals. And to do this, exactly the same science packages, the same kind of studies, the same kind of measurements systematically across the entire Red Sea system. So we, for the first time, can actually compare quantitatively between different coral populations in different regions, etc. And so, and let's just finally right back to this open science. When we generate these data, the idea is to generate a very efficient circle, if you want, or loop of data flow or information flow, where wherever we go and work, we will obtain a lot of data. And by the way, we're not just aiming at obtaining sort of scientific, hardcore science, physiological data on the corals and genetic data, etc. We're also very much interested in a broader set of data, which reaches clearly into the more social sciences. And in fact, there's a dialogue to have, discussion to have here locally between the UNIL and EPFL. Where demographic, urbanization, agricultural things that are changing in a socio-economic scenario along the coast of the Red Sea clearly will have an impact on the reef, and this is clearly something that has to be taken into account. And all these data are going to be funneled through the Swiss Data Science Center, which exists here, at EPFL and ETHZ, which is of course at the cutting edge of computer science. And all the tools, all the buzzwords, the AI, the deep learning, the data mining, etc. And they're experts in handling highly heterogeneous data. And so through there, we can create a loop of data flow, information flow, and feed it right back to the authorities and to the scientists in the countries around the Red Sea. That's at least the idea. I think I have to finish because I know there's a short format here. So I just want to, with that, thank you for your presence and be happy to take a few questions.
Now, Oliver is a postdoc at the Laboratory of Geographic Information Systems at EPFL. He graduated in bioinformatics at the University of Lausanne and joined EPFL in 2016 for a PhD thesis focusing on the use of environmental genomics to support the conservation of coral reefs. And this approach was developed in collaboration with the French Institute of Research for Development and is now being extended to reef systems around the world. So we're very much interested to hear all about this, Oliver. And whenever you're ready, just share your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Anders, as well for your presentation. So can you see my screen?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. So I'd like just to stress in the beginning that all that I'm going to present right now is part of a collaboration between the Laboratory of Geographic Information Systems, so myself and Stefan Joost here at EPFL, and two researchers from the Institute of Research for Development from New Caledonia, Gaël Lecellier and Véronique Berthaud-Lecellier. So together with them, I've been working on these methods of environmental genomics to support coral reef conservation strategies. And in this presentation, I'd like to give you a bit an overview of what this research is about, and then also to show you what are a bit the obstacles when we try to bring some research coming from the academia into the practical field of reef conservation. And you will see there are many analogies with what Anders just mentioned about the Transnational Red Sea Center. So the first question, and I won't be long on this because Anders already explained this, by why do we care so much about coral reef? So to put it very simply, we care about coral reef because they are the most biodiverse ecosystem in our ocean. And this biological value is then translated in an economic and social value for all the human communities that live next to a coral reef. And the second reason why we care so much about coral reef is because corals, so the building blocks of this ecosystem, are highly threatened. And the main threat that they're facing right now is global warming, which causes coral bleaching. So this is what a coral reef, unhealthy coral reef, look like. And this is what a reef looks like during or just after a bleaching event. So coral bleaching is a stress reaction to thermal stress. And when bleaching persists over several weeks, coral eventually die and the reef ecosystem is then deteriorated or destroyed. And in addition to coral bleaching, we also have human pollutants or human activities that can create harm to the reef. So this can be, for example, the release of industrial or agricultural waste along the coastline that are reversed in the lagoon and then can cause harm to the coral. So all this cocktail of global and local stressor together led to a loss of roughly 50% of the coral all around the world over the last decades. So how are we fighting against this? What are the main conservation tools that are used to fight this decline? So in reef conservation strategies, we mainly have two tools. And as you might guess, they are not very effective right now. So the first one is marine protected areas. So it is the idea of deciding some areas where any human activity is strongly restricted so that we can reduce the impact of local pollution or local human activity. And the problem with protected areas right now is that they are completely ineffective against thermal stress. An alternative or a complementary method to protect the reef is the establishment of these coral nursery, which are a kind of underwater gardens where corals are grown and propagated in a controlled environment, a protected environment, so that they can be used then to restore some reef that have been damaged. And the problem with this is that it's more a posteriori solution. So it's a solution to try to reconstruct a reef that has been damaged. And we usually grow the corals that are available next to where we want to establish the garden. So we don't actually know if the corals that we are using are going to survive against the future stress. So this is actually a bit the problem of both these coral conservation strategies. We don't have the information on the potential of adaptation for the corals that we are protecting here or the corals that we are growing and propagating here. And this is actually where the idea of using genetic analysis comes into the game, because this idea wants exactly try to understand how coral adaptation happened and try to quantify coral adaptation across the entire reef system. So before getting into this genetic method, I'd like just to give you an overview of what happened over the years in the reefs worldwide. So most of the reef around the world went through this kind of trajectory. So they've never been experiencing thermal stress over the years. And right now they are, for the first time over the past decades, facing thermal waves that they never experienced before. And since the corals are not used or not adapted to this kind of stress, we observe a major coral decline. So this is what you observe more or less everywhere around the world. But there are some reefs distributed as well around the world. They are the exception, they are not the rule, that over the years, they have already been exposed to some kind of thermal stress. And this thermal stress initially caused a decline of the corals there, but some corals managed to survive to these heat waves. And these corals propagate themselves, reproduce themselves, reconstructed the reef. And right now, when new thermal waves arrive, these coral manage to stay there and to be resistant to temperature. And the reason why is because they've been selected and their population has adapted to thermal stress. So the question now is, how can we find these heat-adapted corals? And this is where this approach that we developed, the seascape genomics approach, is used. So the idea of seascape genomics is to combine two types of analysis. The first one is an analysis of the seascape environment, and the second one is an analysis of the genomics makeup of coral. So we start usually with the environmental analysis, so remote sensing data. And you have to know that using satellite data, we are able to measure what water temperature has been like since satellite has been released in the air, so roughly 40 years right now. We can measure what water temperature has been like worldwide in any reef system. So we can trace the thermal history of any reef around the world. And then we can select some location, as the one represented here by the white dots, that have been exposed to very contrasted thermal history. And we go at this location, we go scuba diving, and we collect coral samples from this location to run a genetic analysis. And the goal of the genetic analysis is to find out if we are able to identify the genetic characteristics, the genetic signatures of thermal adaptation. So this is really the information that genetics brings. It gives us an insight whether the corals that we collect have or not the potential to adapt to climate change. And once we are able to know what water temperature has been like over the past decades, and if we know how coral adapt to these gradients of temperature or these gradients of thermal stress, we are able then to obtain something like this. This is what we call a map of potential of the potential for heat adaptation of corals, which is based in this environmental and genetic analysis. And what I'm showing you right here is the reef system of New Caledonia, which is located right here next to the Australian Great Barrier Reef. And in this map, it is the first time we run this kind of analysis, with the first time we try to map the potential for adaptation for an entire reef system. And as you can see here, every point in this map is a coral reef around the main island of New Caledonia. And for every reef, we have an estimation of the probability of adaptation for every coral of this reef system. And having this information is extremely useful because, for example, we can visualize that here in the south of New Caledonia, we have an area with a very high probability of adaptation, which could be an ideal location to set up a protected area because we want to preserve this thermally adapted coral against any other type of stressor, because we know that in the years to come, these are going to be the corals that will repopulate the reef of the future. And at the same time, if you want to see what we can do with the other conservation strategies, so coral nurseries, we can take corals from this reef, grow them and propagate them in a protected environment of a coral nursery, and then transplant them back at reefs, for example, here in the East Coast, where the reef has never been exposed to intense thermal stress yet. And so we need to increase the adaptive potential of this reef. And by bringing some corals with this characteristic, we can increase the potential for adaptation at these locations. So now all of these look very straightforward, so we can see very clearly how this kind of representation could be translated then in a view of conservation. But actually, this step here, going from academic research to the practical field of conservation, is not that straightforward. And to try to understand how to perform this step of knowledge transfer, we are organizing back in 2019, at the end of this study in New Caledonia, a regional meeting in New Caledonia, bringing together reef stakeholders from many different small island countries, mostly from the South Pacific region. And among these stakeholders are conservation actors, so local authorities, local communities, NGOs, so people that is in the front line of coral conservation, people who is performing with their own hands the coral conservation actions, such as protecting, creating protected areas or running coral nurseries. And together we brought as well researchers from all the area and also researchers from developed countries. So the idea was to create this network to discuss what are the obstacles that are hampering the transfer of knowledge from academic research into the practical field of conservation. And together with them, we identified three main problems with the knowledge transfer of innovation, which are about how the innovation is perceived in these countries, how the innovation is representative of what's going on in these countries, and also how the innovation is accessible to these countries. So I will use the last few minutes of this presentation just to go through each of these points, explaining what is the problem and how we are trying to cope with these problems. So the first problem is about the perception of how innovation is arriving, how what we create as innovation or as knowledge through this cutting-edge method can be brought into the field of conservation. And it really depends on who is the interlocutor that we have locally, because when we go to coral reef country, we have to speak with conservation actors. So as I said, the local authorities, local communities that manage their own reef. This is very common in the South Pacific, and also NGOs that enforce, for example, coral nurseries. And at the same time, we also have the local researcher, which are a bit the main consulting person for these kind of actors. And so we also have to make sure that local researcher can learn these methods so they can reproduce them in the years to come. So the problems that we have usually is that the conservation actions that are taken are based on their past experience. And in some cases, for example, for the local communities of the Pacific, it's based on the traditional knowledge or the traditional methods that they use to protect the reef. And it is quite difficult for them to imagine what is the place for our innovation inside what they are already doing. And there is quite often a fear that we are going to replace what they've been doing for generations with our new technology. And so this is one of the aspects that is a bit problematic about that. And the second problem that we have is a bit about misconception, because when we arrive with some a genetic tool to enforce coral reef conservation, what people misunderstand sometimes is that we are going to come with genetically modified corals. And this is actually not what we are trying to do. We're just trying to use genetic analysis to find out where the adapted corals are. And from the side of the researchers, we have the main barriers is about the technicalities of the research that we perform, because you can imagine that a research that combines remote sensing and genetics requires a background in computer science that sometimes local researchers don't have and need a specialized training for. So how we try to overcome these two obstacles? Well, first, every time we go to the field to coral reef countries, we try to involve the local stakeholder in the creation of knowledge on their own corals. So as you can see here in this picture, we try really to bring them together with us on the boat so that they can share their local knowledge on the coral. They can explain to us what are the local methods that they use. And at the same time, we can explain to them what is the use of the genetic tool, of the cutting edge tool that we developed, how these tools are not going to replace what they're already doing, but it's something complementary to what they already do. And these exchanges are key, because if you involve as much as possible people who will enforce the conservation strategy in the creation of knowledge, they will be more likely to adopt some of the guidelines that they will provide out of our studies. And at the same time, what we try to do is to train local scientists so that they can be able in the future to reperform or repeat the same studies on their own. So we give training on computer science, on how to run the genetic analysis of coral, how to handle coral DNA in the laboratory. So all these pictures here that you see are part of a project coordinated by the United Nations Development Program that we are running this year in the Western Indian Ocean. So the idea really about this problem of perception is really try to work as much as possible in team up with the local stakeholders and local researchers. And it is quite related to this first problem, the one about the representativity of the studies, because when you have a look at the worldwide distribution of coral reefs, so here you have a worldwide distribution, the reef are shown in green, and I'm showing here, I'm highlighting here the reef of Australia, Japan, and United States. And you can see from this map that roughly 20% of the reef surface worldwide is covered by the reef of these three countries. But the three countries alone account for 2/3 of the studies on coral thermal stress. So this means that roughly 80% of all the reefs worldwide only feature 1/3 of the coral studies on thermal stress. And this is extremely problematic, and it's really related to what Anders said before. If we are, for example, a coral reef manager in Sudan, so here in the Red Sea, how can we apply a finding that has been performed in Australia, for example? And the way of overcoming this problem is exactly what we are trying to do right now, is to run the research in the same countries where this research will then be applied. So, for example, the Transnational Red Sea Center is the perfect example for this in the Red Sea area. The project that I just mentioned in the Western Indian Ocean is doing the same here in Mauritius and in Seychelles. And we also have a project in the Caribbean here that is led by the IRD, and it's a project in the French Antilles which wants to collaborate with the local marine reservists. And then the goal for the next few years is to run a large-scale project in the Southwest Pacific, bringing together all these small island countries of the region. So, for example, Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Island, to bring this cutting-edge research in their own reef so that they can perform the analysis with us. So the idea for this problem of representativity is simply try to run as much as possible the research directly in the country concerned. And then there is the last problem that we have with knowledge transfer, of the transfer of innovation, which is about the accessibility that our innovation has. So the main problem is that we publish our papers in scientific literature, and scientific literature is complicated to interpret, especially for somebody that doesn't have the background or the skills to understand all the technicalities related to, for example, genetics or remote sensing data. And in addition to this, scientific literature is quite difficult to browse. So if you just type coral reef thermal adaptation on Google Scholar, you just end up with more than 3,000 papers. And so the question is, where do we start from to find the right paper that answer a conservation question that we are interested into? And then even if you manage to find the right paper, you have to hope that it's available in open access. And only 1/3 of the paper worldwide published over the past few years are published in open access, meaning that the vast majority of the paper available online are still not in open access. And for us in Switzerland, is not a big problem because we have EPFL that pays the subscription to the papers, but in developing countries, this subscription is just too expensive to be affordable. And so people don't have access to this knowledge in the scientific literature. So these are 3 points that needs to be somehow overcome. And one way we are doing it is to try to create alternative media to transpose the knowledge that we create into a practical conservation perspective. So all these different papers about coral adaptation can be translated, for example, in something like this. So this is a web application called the DRAPO, which is an acronym for the Digital Reef Adaptive Potential Evaluator. And the idea behind DRAPO is really to give access to what I showed before. So the map that I showed you before about coral adaptation through an interactive interface. It's sort of like a Google Maps, but of coral adaptation, where any reef stakeholders can log in complete open access and then try to visualize the potential for adaptation directly on a map. You can also visualize different indices of connectivity, can even draw a protected area on the map and then see what would be the impact of this protected area in terms of adaptive potential of the corals. And so this is, of course, just a prototype. We are trying to develop it with new data, and hopefully in a few years, we'll be able to provide a tool that will support the conservation action of coral reef stakeholders all around the world. So just to conclude, as I said, the field of coral reef conservation has a huge potential for innovation, because I just mentioned what we are currently doing with genomics and remote sensing, but Anders and his lab are working on some very cutting-edge ecophysiological analysis. Davis Tuya is working in machine learning of coral reefs. So the technology is actually there. And what we really need right now is to try to orient from the beginning our research activity toward a conservation perspective. And as I said, we have really to focus on these 3 aspects. So how our research will be perceived, how is this representative of local context, and how it is easy to access to what we create in academic research. And the last problem probably is about also the funding schemes, because we are not talking anymore about pure research. We're talking about something in the middle between research and conservation. And one point that we might even discuss later in the question time is how to get dedicated funding schemes that goes a bit in between an applied conservation and the research that we do. So this is all I had to say, and thank you very much for your attention.